Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members-only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. It's been 2 weeks since we came to you last. We had a week off last week for the pod, so it's been 2 weeks. And normally 2 weeks is not an incredibly long period of time, but right now it is an incredibly long period of time because we're in a different political world than the one that we joined you for 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, we were 2 or 3 days into Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. We had that initial burst of political contributions that I think ended up being something like upwards of $100 million in 24 hours or 36 hours. I don't remember the exact amount, but a major rush of political giving, and that certainly sort of portended what was to come, but we didn't have a clear sense of that yet. At that point, we didn't have any feedback from public opinion data. Obviously, as we have small contribution giving has become a sort of virtual voting in contemporary politics. It's a way, your candidate has a good debate. You raise a bunch of money. Often, sometimes bad things happen, and you raise a bunch of money. When someone tried to shoot President Trump, there was a big rush of giving. After the abysmal debate performance that knocked Joe Biden out of the race, there was a burst of giving, not comparable to what we saw later with Harris, but it's a way to show support, show all sorts of things. So it was a sign of things to come, but we really couldn't have. There was no way to know what was coming, and what was coming is that we have, I think, what at this point there's no denying is a transformed presidential race. It sort of depends where you want to mark the bar from, but between the poll averages, if you take the poll averages just before Joe Biden dropped out to where they are now, Kamala Harris has moved 5-6 points forward. She's now at least a couple points ahead of Donald Trump, which is something that had not happened through the entire previous year of the presidential campaign. We had gotten used to this, relatively static race in which Joe Biden was really close. He might be a point or two back in the national averages, and he would get up to a point back, occasionally to half a point back, but he would not get ahead. And we were kind of, locked in this very narrow range. But that's all changed. Certainly for the popular vote averages, Kamala Harris is now ahead. There's no question about that. You factor in the electoral college bias, she probably needs to be a couple points ahead to win the race. She is a couple points ahead right now. If you look at it on a state-by-state basis, you have Harris now has very small but significant leads in the blue wall states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And what is an even bigger shift, because the blue wall states were kind of margin of error up until the last month of Biden's campaign. But he was really not in the running in the southern tier states. And by southern tier states, of course, we mean Arizona, Georgia. Nevada is not exactly southern tier, but sort of classed ethnically and demographically with those states, not least because you've had a lot of new immigration to Nevada, which is, different from Georgia, but there's some similar dynamics. In any case, those states are now very close. So what that means altogether is that, at the end of Joe Biden's campaign, the optimistic look there was you hold on to the blue wall states and you win the election with like one electoral vote. And that was up until the end, that seemed, maybe not likely, but doable. Kamala Harris has several different paths to an electoral college win right now. She is at least in contention. And when I mean contention, I mean when you're, within a point or two in the polls in a state. Although in some of these states, she's doing better than that. She's at least in contention in all of the states that Joe Biden won in 2020. And now North Carolina is at least in the mix. Now, North Carolina has been a graveyard of Democratic dreams for many years. If memory serves, Barack Obama won it, I think, his first time in 2008. I believe he lost it in 2012. Since then, it's been very close each time, but Republicans have won it. So, it's funny. My co-host Kate was away last week. And when she's away, like I don't see her. I don't get, I don't spend virtual time with her in these podcasts. So part of me kind of thinks she's been like, she's been held hostage somewhere for 2 weeks and she's missed all the news. But in fact, obviously that's not the case. And she's been back from vacation, I think, for at least several days. So it's not like she hasn't been keeping track of the news. But Kate, at least since we have not spoken, since the last podcast, what do you make of the whole thing? Before we get to the topics we're talking about, what do you make globally the last 2 weeks?
So when we initially spoke right after Harris's ascension, we were kind of, in those really heady, euphoric days, we were talking about how Democrats had gone from demoralized to kind of, like ecstatic at a level that we just hadn't seen for a really long time. And I think even if we didn't really mention it explicitly then, the question was, how long does it last, right? The quote unquote kind of Harris honeymoon. And does the enthusiasm of these super plugged in voters, which is the stew that you and I kind of live in, does that translate in a meaningful way to people who like don't pay attention to politics and yet who will decide the election, right? And on that second point, it takes a while, right? Like we're still kind of getting in data points to figure that out. And I do think these kind of quote unquote low information voters tend to be some weeks behind those of us who are really plugged in. So a reaction that for us took like 48 hours, right? The whole Harris is the nominee, it's a new race, everything is new, takes a few weeks to kind of sift down to those lower levels of paying attention. But what I have found stunning is that the enthusiasm hasn't seemed to wane, that in this kind of crucial period of defining Kamala Harris, the Trump campaign is still as all over the place as they were in those first hours, like they're still doing the throwing spaghetti at the wall type thing. They're not really staying committed to one line of attack, which indicates that they're not reaping the rewards from kind of any one line that they want to have. We'll get into this more in depth, but Trump has just been an absolute disaster. I think his campaign has been so eager to crow about their newfound discipline, their newfound savviness. And to some degree, I think that was true in terms of the Biden is too old and losing his marbles attack. Like that was months, if not years of message discipline, which helped along by the right-wing kind of media ecosystem, had completely permeated mainstream reporting, had completely permeated voters' ideas of Biden, which is why when he had his catastrophic debate performance, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? Because everyone had been stewing in this for so long. But now, we talked about this in those early days, that he was spending all his time on Truth Social, kind of railing against the unfairness of it all, the fact that they'd spent their whole campaign fighting someone who wasn't in the race anymore. And maybe you expected that to be kind of, classic Trump kind of throwing a tantrum like he does, and then they're gonna get back up on the horse. But it's just kind of endured. Like he's, yesterday was on Truth Social doing fan fiction about Biden, like storming the gates of the convention to wrest back the nomination and debate Trump again. Like, I am just shocked that for a party for whom running against a Black woman would seem to be bread and butter, right? Like it's some of the biggest evils that they see in society. So you would really think they'd be ready to kind of come out swinging, that they would have developed a way to make the kind of racism and misogyny under the surface, right? Like
lo-fi enough.
Yeah, we saw some of that with the DEI presidency stuff. But my God, like they really are acting. I mean, the biggest theme you can kind of pull out of the reaction is they're being like, well, this is so unfair. And it's like, okay. I mean, are we playing Foursquare?
Yep.
Like,
it is unfair.
Right.
Sucks to be you. Yep.
And what a just kind of like weak, petulant response in lieu of any kind of coordinated rebuttal. And like, we'll get into this with the Walz stuff too, but oh my God, talk about like flailing, with their kind of initial reactions to him of doing the, he also is a California liberal. That is like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, there was I think about a week into this, the Times published a piece that was like, okay, enough of that now. The honeymoon is coming to an end, back to reality. But no, that didn't, there's clearly been this media, that'll be enough of that now kind of thing, wanting to shut it down. And that has not happened in any clear way. It has clearly been, the fact that it hasn't has clearly been helped along by the polls, because each time there's sort of an effort to push, a media effort to push that. And I don't mean some of this, I do mean a media effort to clamp her down, but some of that is, the press wants the next thing. Some of that is natural. They're kind of, okay, you're in now. Let's talk about this issue. Let's talk about that issue. So some of that is legit. Some of it's not legit. But each time you get that refrain, there's another round of polls showing her going a little further ahead. And Democrats get all juiced up again and start pouring money over her head. And you're back to the races, sort of. And so it feeds on itself. And so each time, the fact that her momentum in various metrics, by polls, by money, keeps moving forward, it's you keep having the sort of the Democratic base, not just the Democratic base, say, nope, we're not done yet. It's only 10 p.m. This party's got a long way to go, right? So it's very interesting to see that. And there was I beat up a lot on the Times these days, but it is what it is. There was the day before Biden, actually the night before Biden dropped out, and that was in that period where every day we thought Biden might drop out the next day, but we'd thought that for the previous 10 days. So we were kind of in this weird reality where it was impossible to know what was happening. The Times published a piece that was, clearly a readout from the Trump campaign saying, if it's Harris, bring it. Because we are locked and loaded. We've got the ads in the can. We've got the TV time booked. And we are just going to destroy her on the launch pad. We can't wait. We've got all the messaging lined up and everything. And, campaigns do that. They try to psych each other out, and that's natural and everything. So I think the Times was pretty credulous in how they ran that story, kind of taking the Trump campaign's bombast as news as opposed to here's what they're saying. But with all that, I kind of assumed they'd be locked and loaded. How could they not be locked and loaded? I mean, what the heck? We'd been in that Biden swan song thing for 3.5 weeks. And just to be frank about it, Biden's an old man and she's the vice president. So over the course of the last year, just in actuarial terms, it's not totally insane that she could have become the candidate, right? I mean, you needed to have thought through this possibility. And yet, from the first moment, they were just not ready. And for the first, for the first 48 hours, I kind of accounted that as you can see things coming in the future and you can sort of think through how you're going to react to them. But certain things are so colossal, so unexpected, even if you expect them, so historic that you can't really get your head around what it's going to be like if they happen until they happen. And as you said, Kate, you got Trump up there saying, we want our money back. We ran against Sleepy Joe. It's unfair. And I'm sort of like, okay, dude. Yeah, that is sort of a bummer for you. But like, what? Too bad, right? I mean, what are we talking about here? But they have not really come back from that. And they have, you said the point about, in a way, it's their ultimate campaign. They're running against a black woman, right? What could be better for them? But that's also the point. It's just the flame and they're the moth. Right, it's their thing, and you sort of saw it with the, what was it, the 36 hours of the DEI candidate, and even the sort of the top Republicans are sort of like, guys, that's a little too, little too sharp. And they've just been, they have not even, they have not even come up with a message, let alone been able to make that message land. And the Harris is obviously not a new person. She's been the sitting vice president for 3.5 years, but she was not very defined. And these kind of quick definition things, it's a 2 or 3 week race, and that tends to stick. And now we're 2.5 weeks in, and so they're getting clobbered on that front.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair to Trump, which it's really important to me to be, Democrats kind of played it perfectly in terms of timing, because you waited till after the Republican convention, right? Let them waste that free air time on running against Biden. Biden drops out. Okay, all the attention shifts to the Democrats, right? And then he taps Harris. And then there's like a 24-hour waiting period of, is it going to be her? Is it going to be somebody else? She emerges. Okay, then we have the deluge of enthusiasm. That captures all the attention. And then we have these 2.5 weeks where it's exciting, right? She's shiny. She's new. All of her rallies are getting kind of blanket network coverage, which then leads right into the veep stakes. And that's really exciting. And who's she going to pick? And we have, endless stories about sources say it's these 8 people, it's these 7 people, it's these 6 people, right? That Shapiro was seen with black SUVs, and what does that mean? And watching tail numbers, and Shapiro's going to be in Philadelphia, like it's a swing state, right? Like all that, from the silly to the earnest, but that's exciting, right? And it's a moving target, so reporters love it because there's endless iterations to cover. And then we have the excitement that the Harris campaign was leak proof, so we never really knew anything.
I was shocked when I heard it was Walz. I mean, we'll get into this in a minute, but just at the basic level of, I was sure it was Shapiro.
Right.
So, I mean, and I'm pretty plugged into politics, and I was shocked. So they kept it pretty tight.
And that kept the mystique up right until the moment that she wanted to announce, and then that's capped off with yesterday's giant riotous rally at Temple in Philly, where he's on the stage for the first time, so that gets blanket coverage. And all of this, we're now 2 weeks away from the Democratic convention, which is going to be yet more free
less
media.
Less than 2 weeks, a week and a half.
Right. Okay. So more free media. There's going to be, everyone's going to be interested in kind of the Biden speech there. You're going to have Obama there. All the Democrats are going to be in this like feel good, look at us kind of mood. And then, so where does that leave us? The convention starts the 19th. Is that right?
18th or 19th.
Okay.
It's
then,
that Monday. It's that Monday of the week, whatever
so
that
it
is.
Wraps up more or less roughly right at the beginning of September, right around there, right? That's basically right before some states are going to start voting. Like early voting is going to start within a couple weeks of that. I mean, that's crazy, right? And that is such a side effect of this ridiculously fast-paced election that we've never seen anything like it before. In a normal election, Trump could kind of afford to give Democrats all this good attention for, the kind of what month it's going to span, because elections are interminable and you have time to make up ground. Not so in a 3-month election, right? And I mean, right now, he's you can tell that he's desperate to break through and to get the attention back on him, especially because she is breaking through in a way that Democratic politicians never get to, right? They have to struggle and fight and be really creative to kind of exit the political junkie space and enter the kind of normie space. And she's done that, so well that the whole vibe of her campaign is that. So now he's got to do crazy shit to try to kind of get attention back on him, which is how I think we explain the disastrous interview with the National Association of Black Journalists, where, he went on stage before a crowd of Black reporters and said that, Harris isn't really Black. She just decided to turn Black a few years ago. And even that, so he gets attention for kind of being a bore, and then we're right back into the veep stakes, right? We're right back into the convention ramp up. This is just such a turning on its head of the way that we're used to these dynamics going, where Democrats just have to kind of fight tooth and nail to get attention, and it comes so naturally and easily to Trump. And this is the first time we're just seeing that totally switch, and not for reasons of, Joe Biden melted down on stage, but for reasons of Democrats are delighted for the first time since 2008.
Yeah, there's, that for lack of a better word, let's call it that Black Indian thing, that sort of unspeakable horror we watched. There's so many different parts there, because on the one hand, as you said, it's so gross. It's a classic thing, because it's not just gross, but in a very Trumpian fashion, it's so gross that you're just kind of shocked for a second. You just kind of, you're sort of dumbfounded, again, it transcends gross. You kind of there's so many dimensions that it's gross in. And I think the grossest part of it is when you pick it apart, you see that Trump is trying to say that all of this identity stuff, and I don't mean the way that people use kind of identity in this very expansive sense today, but I'm a Black person, I'm of Indian American heritage, these kind of very real things that he's saying, oh, it's kind of a joke thing you people kind of make up. You're one thing, then you're another, and it's just it's so gross, right? And when you first saw the reaction to it, everybody's like, "Oh my God, he's melting down! It's a train wreck." And then, sure as anything, within a few hours, you have a lot of smart people saying, "There's a method to his madness. Don't think too soon. This is him trying to take the media. He's taking the media dominance back. Sure, it's like bad attention, right? But like he's cutting short her momentum and everything. And as you said earlier, that was at a basic level what he was trying to do. Become the center of attention again. And again, even if it's bad attention, I'm center of attention, and now you're reacting to me. And the real tell was there, it lasted about 36 hours. And then it was done. And like, you know, if you can, with his calculus, and I think it's all more intuitive with him, that if you do cut short her momentum and you kind of reset the campaign, maybe it is worth offending a ton of people and outrage. But he didn't even accomplish that. And then, you know, Monday, I think I'm losing track of days here, when you had that big market swoon, the Dow went down 1,000 points, big thing in Asia. They were out by midday with these Kamala crash, the Kamala crash economy, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then the market went overnight. It kind of went back again, and it's still in it. You know, there's still something happening there, but we're not in 2008. And you, in any campaign with a quasi incumbent, when there's any sort of economic hiccup or something, yeah, they're going to hit the candidate on that. But it's only when you're desperate for traction on anything that you turn your whole messaging operation around on like 2 or 3 hours notice to go in on that. They have not figured out what their message is at all. And again, the window on defining her as a candidate it's pretty closed now. And, you know, in addition, that's sort of basic campaign conventional wisdom, that kind of 2 or 3 week window. And it's a conventional wisdom that I think is largely true, unlike a lot of conventional wisdom. But as you said, compressed schedule, you're gonna have that 2 week Democratic, you know, advertisement window with the Veep selection and the convention, which the Trump people wasted on Joe Biden. And so now you're not going to be able to fight that for the next couple of weeks. So they're really boxed in. They and you know, even let me say one more thing. Even more than the horse race numbers, she has gone from like a 20-point deficit of favorability to like a 5-point deficit. And in the modern national campaign age, 5-point deficit is like golden. Right? I mean, and to move like that is astounding. It's just astonishing.
And I do want to address something that might read as a contradiction to listeners, because we've talked about in the past how Trump being out of the spotlight can really benefit him because people forget how boorish and offensive and crazy he is, right? And then you can kind of more easily get suckered by the strength stuff and just forget about the chaos. And the difference between that dynamic and having all the attention on her that's going on right now is that I think when Trump was doing that before, particularly with Biden, the way it was working for him is that when Biden was in the spotlight because of his age, because of, you know, he tripped on stage or he messed up people's names and introduced Zelensky as Putin, whatever you have there, all the attention he was getting was part of Trump's argument to begin with. So Trump could afford to kind of be on the sidelines because every Biden story was like, you know, people are saying off the record that he forgets stuff in meetings, that he doesn't remember someone he met 15 years ago. Like, all the attention he was getting was negative. It's not like Trump was kind of staying quiet and all of the media outlets were talking about Biden's like myriad legislative achievements, right? But now he's on the sideline and all the attention that she's getting is overwhelmingly positive. So those dynamics are a little bit different. And I just wanted to kind of point that out because we have talked about before the pitfalls of not paying attention to Trump. And I think the rectifying of that early kind of debate about how much should he be platformed, right? He's going to lie. How much airtime should he get? And how that kind of, it did have a little bit of backlash in terms of getting him out of people's eyes and letting people forget about how crazy he is, which is compounded by the fact that for whatever reason, he is not called upon to talk to reporters, real reporters, the way that Democrats are. Like, that's just totally gone out the window. You know, people, we're already seeing the kind of clamoring from the big outlets of, you know, well, Harris needs to talk more about policy. Like, we need to know where she stands on things. And they wouldn't even feign that with Trump, right? Because you'd be like, well, obviously he's got no policy stand, right? So that's like a huge kind of asymmetric expectation. But that's what I think is going on here. That's why he's so desperate to break into the news in a way that he wouldn't be, I think, if all the news was like, you know, we've got this Black woman radical from San Francisco and now the stock market is crashing. Like, I think he'd be perfectly happy to let that news cycle unfurl without his, you know, explicit kind of interference with it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's our thinking about campaigns has been conditioned for 3 or 4 years now about, you know, not exactly 2020, but, you know, since, let's say since mid 2021 or so, when if you were paying attention, you knew there was going to be a presidential rematch between these two men. That everything is shaped by the idea that you have two candidates who are both pretty unpopular. And so the sort of the theory, you know, a lot of Democrats thought it was very unfair that Biden was unpopular because they thought he'd done a really good job. But just statistically, the reality was he was unpopular. So you're talking about, when we're talking about, you know, is the attention on Biden? Well, the assumption has been if the attention is all on Biden, he's going to lose because it's unpopular. So you need Trump to have attention too, because people dislike him even more. And people don't want to go back to all the bad stuff and all that kind of stuff. If when your candidate is getting attention, it's good attention, then awesome, right? I mean, at least in and look, we need to be realistic that we cannot expect exactly this political moment to just be a straight line between now and November 5th. But at least in this moment, Democrats would be perfectly happy for this political moment literally to last for the next 3 months with no interruption whatsoever, because it is getting people excited about supporting Kamala Harris. And yeah, and you know, there's a whole part of this now that Joe Biden's political weaknesses in a lot of ways just allowed people to ignore Donald Trump's political weaknesses. And I don't mean being a insane degenerate as that is his political weakness, but I mean being pretty unpopular, as being a serious political weakness of people not wanting him to be president again. And then the other, and this is the part that I still have had a difficult time completely getting my head around, he's not as good a candidate. He's a much it's hard to say rambling and shambling, because it's pretty rambling and shambling in 2016, but it's different. And as long as, so like if we think about the last 12 months before Joe Biden stepped aside, Donald Trump was doing all sorts of crazy, stupid things. But as long as he was a couple points ahead, okay, he's doing crazy, stupid things. And I think if you had this this progression on the Republican side where a lot of the Republican political class was like, don't do this again. He's going to lose. This dude is going to lose. And the big money guys, the billionaires, the ones who write, multi-million-dollar checks, they're like, we're done with him. We don't want to do that again. But again, as long as even though he was still being ridiculous, but he's a couple points ahead, eventually everybody says, pretty hard to say he's a sure loser when he's winning. So like, let's do it. But it's not clear to me that this Donald Trump has the kind of, it's not even stamina exactly. It's the fluidity. It's the dynamism to fight back. And at least these first 2.5 weeks really seem to confirm that he's just not, he's not there. And the mix of how much of that is Biden, I'm getting a little little questionable here myself. How much of that is Trump versus Harris is still a little fuzzy to me.
I mean, and that was so punctuated by Trump's immediate kind of capitulation on the debate thing. Like, what a kind of unforced error there, where he just immediately was like, well, I'm not debating anymore, leaving everyone with the obvious conclusion that he's afraid to debate her. And then he pivots to, well, okay, I'll debate if it's like my buddy is doing the moderating and the crowd is all Trump supporters. E.g., I will permit you to come to one of my rallies. And we can debate there. Yeah. So, I mean, which just kind of that on top of his tantrums on Truth Social. I mean, it leaves you with the impression that he is so angry and that this whole campaign was crafted to run against Joe Biden. And now they are not only not running against Joe Biden, but they're running against someone who lacks the weakness that campaign was crafted to attack, right? Like, this would be a different situation if the crux of their attacks on Biden had to do with his tenure, right? His legislative record, because she carries that as well. But it just wasn't that deep. It was just about he seems older than people remember. And we're going to go after that and imply that he's not sharp enough to do the job and he's losing his marbles. And then you bring in Harris, who, you know, I mean, she's not old to begin with. She's almost 60, but she also looks way younger than that.
Yeah,
and
she presents much younger than
I mean, it's the classic thing of Harris and Walz being held up next to each other, right? And she looks about 20 years younger than he does.
And they're like 2 years difference, 3 years
exactly.
difference, something like that. Yeah.
Which he reacted to really funny on Twitter. He said, yeah, well, I used to be in charge of a lunchroom, so that's what gets you looking like this. But, you know, the thing is also, not only does she look young, not only does she kind of project vitality and energy, her whole personality, and the thing that I think Republicans kind of hoped to turn into a weakness, which has actually become the strength of her campaign, is her joy and her exuberance, right? Like, they tried to make her laugh a big problem, but everybody is kind of reacting to it in a way that she seems warm, she seems fun, which are things that Trump is just so aggressively not. And that's what has kind of struck me about this. And I think this will segue well into the Walz thing, which is crazy that we're 40 minutes in and we haven't talked about yet. But Biden's contrast with Trump was Trump is chaos, Trump is danger, Trump is anger. Biden is calm, Biden is boring, Biden is normal, Biden is unifying, right? That was the contrast that worked for Biden in 2020, especially amid the pandemic and all these kind of extenuating circumstances. Now, the contrast is still, you know, Trump is angry, Trump is aggressive, he's the same. But then Harris is fun, and she is warm, and she is lighthearted, and she dances at stuff, and she can laugh at herself. And being part of her campaign is being part of that exuberance, that joyful warrior kind of mentality that then brings in the pop culture signifiers and the turning the kind of online jokes into merch, and, you know, getting the singers involved and getting the actors involved. And that it's a really different split screen. And I think it's why people keep bringing up Obama round one, because Democrats haven't had a campaign that feels so exciting in a long time. But, you know, that's the split screen. And this is why, and we can maybe get into this now, I think that Walz was a really good pick kind of aesthetically and from a vibes perspective, right? Because he put himself on this short list through his auditioning. Like, he was not one of the natural picks.
That is something that I've lost track. Is it 24 hours? You know, in the however many hours it's been since she picked him. That point that I guarantee you, no one in the Thunderdome era, no one was in like, you're for Shapiro? I'm for Walz, man. Right. Forget Whitmer. No one was talking about Walz or as a VP. But you're right. He did it. He just kind of went on TV and says, check this out, and kind of put himself there. And that in itself is pretty shocking.
Remarkable, especially
yeah.
with such a truncated period to vet people. You could see the Harris campaign taking the tack of absolute caution and just going in the direction of the most known entity kind of available to them that made sense. But instead, he got on TV. If he was not the one to say it first, he kind of became the standard bearer of the "they're weird"
He's
thing.
Like the Pied Piper of weird.
Exactly.
He yep.
He's got just a treasure trove of anecdotes that people like, you know. I mean, I feel like every single time I see a new screenshot of 3 paragraphs about him, it's like, you know, it's the universal lunch stuff, it's the being the advisor to the Gay Alliance group in the 90s, it's, you know, how he taught the Holocaust, it's that he brought his football team from being, you know, 0-27 to winning whatever. I mean, he did that himself. Like he caught her eye specifically per the reporting and launched himself into being a finalist, despite the fact that he comes from Minnesota and his other kind of top finalists, Shapiro and Mark Kelly, come from states that would, if she wins, she wins, yep. right? Yep. Like, yep. So, I mean, an incredible feat. And I think does go back to this point that he is an aesthetic match for the kind of campaign that she's running that has had such liftoff, which is joyful, which is not cowed or scared by Trump, which is taking the strategic and I think really smart approach to do the kind of weird, condescending, like, not the, you know, we're not going low instead of going high, but kind of treating them as just like, these guys are freaks, honestly. Like, they're strange. We don't have to tiptoe around that, which I think is really smart because Democrats have often been pulled back in the direction of they are huge threats. They are really scary. Like, Trump wants to be a dictator. And all that is true and all that is important, but it has not broken through the same way. You know, we've seen a ton of,
and like, it also puffs up their power.
Exactly. It makes him seem strong. And when we hear from focus groups and kind of swing voters and stuff, the democracy is in danger stuff just doesn't really work with them. It strikes them as hyperbolic and they don't fully buy it because they haven't been paying attention to the kind of structural ways that Trump would attack the government. And there's just no more effective attack against a strong man than laughing at him. And that's been true with Trump since the beginning. I mean, he is okay with being feared, right? He is not okay with being ridiculed.
Yeah, no, he loves being feared. That's his whole, I mean, you even see it, you know, in his Sir stories, right? I mean, that's not being feared exactly, but you are the big, strong, heavy. And like I, a brawny construction worker, I'm just coming to you in as a supplicant, that, you know, that kind of stuff. And that was, you know, with the weird stuff, that was, as you said, who knows who. I mean, we've been calling these guys weird for decades, but he was the one who put it out there in the sort of the mass, you know, political culture thing. And that is really that in, what's so big about that, regardless of whether people are using that word in a month, is that it embedded in that is what you just described, which is that whatever, like you're just like criticizing in a very damning way, but in a way like I barely care. You don't scare me. I just don't want to be around you because you're weird. You're weird, you know. And it's one of these things that what has been so difficult about it for the MAGA people and Republicans, sort of more generally, is it is just sticky. You know, it's like picking up some Nutella that's been out in the sun, right? You touch it and it's all over you, and you can't really. There's no rebutting it other than to say, "I'm not weird." Like, okay, weirdo, like whatever, you know, it's just sticky in that way. And, in the first couple days of that, I had a number of people, some pretty big people in politics, ask me, you know, sir, right?
Crying, tears streaming,
crying, coming to me. Yes, exactly. Coming to me like, what do you think of the weird thing? Do you think is this okay? Is you know, I think there was this sense of like, we've got all of these things we criticize them that are super important. Are we giving them up for some kind of catchy meme TikTok nonsense? But I think everybody quickly realized no, because weird actually is a signifier for all those things that we think are so important, but resonates for people who are not in our conversation. Because you hear about JD Vance wanting the local sheriff to be able to pull up your OBGYN records, and people just say, dude, what? Like what are you talking? Like, just like, it's just like, what is that? And you talk about the whole rule of law conversation, the democracy conversation, the attack on rights conversation, but just an everyday person hears that and you're like, dude, what is going on with you? Like, what's that? What's your problem? And I think when Trump did that, again, Black Indian thing, for lack of a better word, I think what they were hoping was that the opposite side would get very outraged, start talking about systemic racism, that Harris would announce a teaching moment speech about the new America and stuff. And all those things are true. But that would have put it back where Trump wanted it to be. Let's forget all that momentum stuff. Let's forget all that excitement and momentum and we're blah, 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 blah. And let's get it back to talking about race. And we'll talk about all the stuff. And they didn't. The Harris's campaign was their response was basically like, whatever, dude. Like, you're weird. Like, whatever. And that was, they couldn't break through. And you see, there's sort of two elements of this. On the one hand, the Trump campaign has not gotten its footing yet with Harris. I mean, that's clear. Everybody can see that. And you're now, as Kate mentioned before, you're now going into a period of a couple weeks where Democrats are just naturally going to hold the stage just because of the convention and all that kind of stuff. So that's happening. But there is a characterological, personal thing happening with Trump where he's really, really upset because he thought he was about to be president again, and he might, but like, that doesn't look great right now. So he's like kind of losing it himself and kind of collapsing into his rage and anger. So the kind of things that strike people as weird, they're just going to start coming, faster and faster because that's who he is and he can't help it.
I also think the weird thing is a bit of an anecdote to Democrats' obsession with specificity. Like, the party has, and I think it comes from a good place. I think this comes from a place of feeling that Democrats are the party that tells the truth, that has an adherence to fact, that isn't comfortable lying to people. But sometimes that manifests as an inability to use shorthand in the way that the right is masterful at, right? I mean, that manifests in all kinds of ways. That's pro-life, that's right to work, that's we know what a woman is, right? That all of those things have always triggered these responses from Democrats that are like really, really hard to capture on a bumper sticker because they're trying to be more honest and they're trying to kind of explain a more complicated and balanced policy position. So, you kind of get, they want to kill babies from the right. And then from the left, it's no, almost nobody gets an abortion at the end of their pregnancy. Those are almost always medical emergencies. And we actually want to give women access to abortion and also, support. And it's this asymmetry of messaging because Republicans are just much more comfortable with kind of using shorthand, even if it's misleading, even if it's non-nuanced, right? And weird is such a good anecdote to that because it's not, he's weird and he's dangerous and he wants to do Schedule F and abortion and he'll get more Supreme Court seats. It's just, it encapsulates a right wing that is so radical, that is so being born in these like online spaces of anger and hatred and bigotry, and that are also dangerous but also weird. Like, is it dangerous to kind of be obsessed with birth rates and, you know, forcing women to have children? Obviously, of course, anyone who's read The Handmaid's Tale can tell you that. But it's also weird. Like, that's a strange thing to get fixated on, right? And like, people understand that. I mean, that works in the abortion context as well, that we know from all these special elections that even people in red states think it's weird that politicians are so hung up on this kind of one medical procedure, right? So I just think it really is so effective and so like shocking to people, because this is something that Democrats are usually so bad at, right? Is like shorthand, is being pithy, is not over explaining, it's not being professorial, it's just being like, no, that's weird, we're just going to leave it at that, right? Like, we're not going to get into a fight with you about kind of biological sex versus gender. We're just going to call it weird that you're so obsessed with like the genitalia of the children of this country, and just leave it at that. And they're right, it is weird.
It's funny, but you know, we had this as sort of an episode of this in the Olympics. I mean, because I'm not weird, I did not even get into it that far. I don't know if was it boxing or some sort of mixed martial arts, boxing. Or boxing, where I guess the woman, she is not trans, but the point is that you have all of MAGA land who probably didn't even know there was women's boxing in the Olympics, suddenly totally fixated. And I think a lot of people, you know, normal people look at that. You may have a range of opinions, kind of like, oh, you know, there's female boxing, and I guess sometimes there's genetic anomalies, and you know, this woman, I guess, has, you know, statistically higher testosterone levels than most women, but kind of like, okay, like, but I also have a life, and like, I'm not I'm not going to completely turn my world over to that, but these people do turn their world over to that. And that is, you know, one of the things when we talk about signifiers and taglines, you know, something like weird, you know, for certain parts of the electorate, it's enough just to hear they're weird and to think, yeah, you're right, they are weird. I don't want those people to be in charge of what's happening. If you want more information, we're the Democrats. We got tons of information. You want to hear about democracy, you want to hear about this, that, and the other, and Project 2025 and Schedule F, but if weird's enough for you, cool. You know, it's sort of like with the Olympics, in that most of us don't know much about pole vaulting or that thing where they throw the rock, right? And I know some of you are kind of like, you're totally into it and totally into fencing and you live it. For most of us, it's just once every 4 years, and that's cool. That they use this stick and they jump up in the air. That's awesome. We only need a little of that, and that's how politics works. You know, we talked about, you mentioned before that you know, swing voters tend to not be very taken with the whole democracy thing. You know, I think you turn that around and it's pretty self-evident. If you're into democracy, you're not going to be a swing voter in this election. I mean, if that's your thing, you've seen enough, right? So it's the people who are not particularly struck by that. So the other thing is, you know, very early in the weird thing, David Frum did this tweet where he said, and I don't think this is the entirety of weird, but it's at least 2/3 of it, that weird in this conversation is a shorthand for obsessive hostility towards women. And that really is, again, about 2/3 of it, not all of it, but even the stuff that's not that, you dig in a little and it's kind of that, right? And what he said is that they're flailing because they don't even understand the conversation that they're being overwhelmed by. They don't get what people are reacting to. Not just that that's what Democrats are saying about them, but that is why it's resonating. That people see it and they're like, yeah. And there was about a week where their response was, oh, yeah, I'm weird. Here's you in a picture with a disgusting trans person. You're weird, right? And not getting kind of like, you being that obsessed about and that angry at trans people, that's not convincing us you're not weird. That's why you're weird. Because look, in American society, there is, even outside of the MAGA world, there's a spectrum of people's comfort level with with the whole trans world, with the visibility of trans people. There's a spectrum of comfort level. Certain people kind of like it's just that's awesome and that's great. Other people it's new and they're kind of uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean you're angry, like really angry, like taking vulnerable people and showering hatred on them and saying terrible things about them. So that I think what makes one of the permutations about weird is that even parts of the population that trans visibility is new and not totally comfortable for them, they're still not angry like that. And weird kind of means, why you're angry and you're obsessed, and that's like there's something kind of charged and toxic about you. And that is kind of on a spectrum with, like, again, you want to be able to pull women's OBGYN records because they might become pregnant and they might go to Kansas and get an abortion. And you don't want to let the local sheriff doesn't want to let that happen. And like, that's weird. Like, right. Maybe that person isn't totally comfortable with abortion, but that's still weird. That's weird.
Normal people will see them, the whole right, mobilizing to go after this Algerian boxer and be like, that's mean, right? Like, there's a woman who, is going on to compete for a gold medal in the Olympics. Like, this is one of the peaks of her and every athlete's career. And she's been deluged in hatred, right? And all this kind of stuff. I mean, I think this is why Andy Bashir, like, part of the reason I think he was on the short list is that his response to the attack on trans kids in his state is so good. He just says, I think that, all kids are God's children and we should be protecting them and not attacking them. And it's like, yeah, obviously, right? Like, for everyone who isn't a just vicious kind of anti-trans activist, that's the obvious answer. It's like none of your business, right? So, no, I think that's totally right. And it just, weird has the happy side effect of including ridicule, including mocking, including, I just don't want to sit at a lunch table with you, versus fearful, right? Versus scary, versus dangerous, which has the side effects of strength, of intimidation, and all those kind of qualities that Trump has used to his advantage. And I think this all does just play in so well to the vice presidential pick, because you said earlier, Josh, that you were really surprised it wasn't Shapiro. And I have to say, I wanted it to be Walz, but I would have had my money on Shapiro as well, just because we know that we're no longer in an era where Harris could pick a vice president from Texas and wow, she just delivered the Southwest to herself. Like, that's not how it is anymore. But we still have some indications of a small bump. And even if that bump is a point may win that Pennsylvania. Point, yep. So that's a huge, appeal. And also he's extremely popular, right? He's telegenic. He's a good speaker. He
had that road thing too, where they fixed like
the highway in like
road
a week.
In like, in like a week or something. That was impressive.
Totally. So, you had all those things going, but it's interesting because I think the Walz appeal is a little bit less calculated in terms of, it's less, okay, that could be an electoral advantage, right? And we need that state, and maybe that state helps you with the other blue wall, I don't know, Rust Belt, whatever kind of thing.
Yeah, it's certainly culturally adjacent to the blue wall states, even though it's
Right.
not one itself.
Right. And then for Walz, it's such a more of a personality pick than a kind of calculated electoral advantage pick. And we know now from the kind of TikToks of the last few days of her selection that basically her people came to her after, they did this high-speed vetting, and they had a list as long as like 7 or 8 people, and by the end it was pretty clear it was Kelly Shapiro or Walz. And they came to her and said, look, with whatever kind of focus groups and polling that they could do in this abbreviated timeline, that it wasn't clear to them that any of them would give her that decisive electoral boon, that it wasn't clear Shapiro would be able to deliver Pennsylvania, or that Kelly would be able to deliver Arizona, and that she could win with any of them. And at that point, it becomes a lot more the personality pick, who she meshes with, right? Who will be happy in a supporting role, which is really difficult for politicians, many of whom, by the time you're on the VP shortlist, you probably have presidential ambitions or have had them at some point. And, from everything we know, and the stories are remarkably similar, which kind of show that the Harris camp is shaping the story and the way they want it to be told. But it's that she kind of came out of her meeting with Walz and she just really liked him. She thought he had a great personality. There are little tidbits that are identical across all the stories, that he volunteered things that he said were his weaknesses, that he'd never read off a teleprompter before, that he's not a particularly good debater. He said that he didn't want her to pick him if he wasn't going to help her win. He said that he does not want to run for president, which was pretty huge, I think, because especially with kind of a transitory administration like this one, you've got this heavy bench, all of whom were kind of being talked about as either potential nominees or potential vice presidents, that indicate those people are going to want to bite at the apple sooner rather than later. So it's definitely an advantage to not have a Shapiro who so obviously wants to be president, right? And that was clear in their interviews as well, as much as it is in his public appearances. So, by that point, it just became who fits the vibe of the campaign. Clearly Walz does. Who she really likes and gets along with, and ditto there. And I think that just makes sense to me in how I think this process has unfolded and how it seemed to me, which is I would have been kind of perfectly happy with any of the top contenders. I think they all had obvious strengths and limited weaknesses. I was most uncomfortable by Shapiro's handling of the sexual harassment thing in his office. I thought that could be really damaging based on the kind of party Democrats are and the kind of campaign she'll run, especially where women's rights are so in the forefront.
No, I agree with that. I agree. And it's also, I think it is also that way because it's not a binary thing. No one's saying he harassed anybody, right? It's like how it was handled, whether my point is that it's not, it's something that will just float there. That it wasn't handled great, and maybe it was terrible, but it's not going to be a thing like you're going to have one piece of paper and you're like, oh, okay, false alarm, nothing, right? It's just going to hang, and so I agree with you. That was a real issue.
So then, by the end, this idea that they, the top 3 would all be good in these various ways, and she kind of got the latitude to just pick who she liked the best. I'm just really comfortable with that. And I think we've been so in these Veep stakes because they're exciting and they're news producing, and that kind of belies the reality that, as JD Vance is saying these days, the vice presidential pick doesn't really matter. But in terms of kind of what Walz brings that I think is so useful is he does not seem scary. He has the cultural signifiers of moderation, despite the fact that he's governed quite progressively. But we're seeing Trump kind of come out of the gate with this whole, he's a super lib. He did all these crazy leftward things in Minnesota. And that is true, right? Like, there's a reason why labor really liked Walz, why progressives really like Walz. Like, he does have a really progressive record, but he is a jolly, affable former teacher, former football coach, veteran, hunter from rural Minnesota. Like, you're just not going to convince people who have no idea what Joe Biden's legislative history is, much less Tim Walz, that this guy is scary. And that, unfortunately, is something Harris needs, because it's a lot easier to convince those people that a black woman from San Francisco is scary than it is this, kind of Santa Claus from Minnesota.
I think the other thing, even, you mentioned before, he says he doesn't want to run for president. I mean, that can change after being vice president for a little while, but it is entirely credible to me that the thought hadn't occurred to him, because why would it? He's like some member of Congress who decided to become governor of his. Minnesota's not a small state, but it's not a big state. It's not Texas or California or New York or whatever. And there's nothing about his record that made you think, oh, he's coming, man. That's on his radar. But it had definitely already been on Democrats, sort of social Democrat radar, what they had done in Minnesota once they got a trifecta, right? They basically did the Biden thing if there had been no filibuster. Exactly. Right? They kind of passed everything, and very progressive. But when you actually look at it, it shows something about what very progressive means nowadays. That it's things like free school lunch for everybody. It's things like, I believe they have paid family leave. It's all these things that. They're not things like you're going to do an ad like free fucking school lunch for everybody. That's the hellhole they're dealing with in Minnesota these days. Like, no one's going to hear that and think like, oh man, I can't bring that nationwide. I mean, you may not, maybe you don't support it for budgetary reasons, but it's not scary. And unless you, unless you own a mid-sized business, paid family leave isn't really terrifying either. Like, maybe you don't support it, but it's not terrifying stuff, and most of the stuff is like that. So there's it's not like I don't know, they're not doing kind of mandatory DEI self-criticism sessions and stuff like that, right? That's just not that. It's not what's being talked about there. And the other thing, I think you really keyed in on it, that there was this line during the W. Bush administration, that especially in 2020, 2000, but also in 2004, that you'd want to have a Bush with George W. Bush. You'd want to have a beer with George W. Bush, right? More than John Kerry. Now, whether that's true or not, that was sort of the vibe. And with Kamala Harris, it's like you'd want to dance or go to a party with Kamala because she's fun. She's like, as you said, it's exactly the kind of things they thought they would turn against her, right? So that is the thing that is kind of keyed in for her. And if you look at him, you see the sort of when they were doing these, in the last few days, when, as you said, they're kind of like, oh, there's black SUVs, there's this, there's all these kind of things. You see these kind of weird candidates with him. And it's him in camo, just come back from deer hunting or something like that. that he culturally, in addition to being the Pied Piper of weird and all that kind of messaging stuff, he's culturally sort of mirror opposites of Kamala, but in a way that is also complementary, because you're not going to have Kamala being like, yeah, I'm going out to the range because we just got back from duck hunting and want to do some target practice. Right? That's not going to work for her. That's ridiculous. No one thinks that's who Harris is, but it clearly is kind of who he is. And why not? It's we think of Minnesota, oh, Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale, but it's actually, outside of a couple cities, it's a pretty rural state, and with a lot of pretty isolated areas. up in like, the Iron Range and the a lot of agriculture and stuff like that. So it all makes sense. And it does fit to me. I was expecting it to be Shapiro. I was sold on him, but just in the very narrow sense of an extra 50 votes in Pennsylvania. Like, why not? Right. Just because it's so central. So it wasn't like, even when I don't have a sense of kind of like that he's, in terms of like messaging, or he's anything special. He's good. He was obviously a very ambitious politician, very successful politician. He's very, he's, I think that the margin of his win in 2022 or 2022, not that big a deal to me, because he was running against a total freak who his party basically abandoned. But he's still like 60% approval. So I'm totally down with Walz.
I think the other thing that helps with Walz over Shapiro is just Walz has been a politician for a long time, right? Like, that's true. But the more salient parts of his background are the whole teacher, soldier, football coach thing. And I think that balances out Harris really well, who, JD Vance tried to do the welfare queen baiting thing with she's been collecting a government check. And like, that's obviously atrocious and racist. But it is true that, her career has been in politics, right? Like that's
elective office too. Almost all elective office for like 8 years as DA, 8 years as Attorney General, 4 years or a few years as Senator, Vice President. That she has. I think that the knock on her would be, you got out of law school and you knew you wanted to get into politics, and you got on the ladder and you've been climbing your whole life. And, okay, that's a politician. That's what politicians do. But that is a hit, right? That is a certain way you say, like, you've never kind of lived in the real world. You've never blah, 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 blah.
And
that kind of
that's
thing.
The same hit on Shapiro, right? He's a lawyer, and he kind of rose up to governor through being AG. So their trajectories are just so similar that I think getting Walz's kind of both the folksy affect, and I don't mean affect that he's being inauthentic, but I mean the aesthetics of folksiness.
The signifiers,
are backed up by him having also like lived these other lives that aren't politician lives. And I think that is really, really helpful, because that's Trump's whole shtick, right? Like, his whole thing is, I am a wealthy businessman who just kind of like got into politics to fix what was broken. Like, his whole thing, and what made his campaign in 2020 so difficult for him, is that it's an outsider pitch, right? It's I'm not part of the system. I'm here to break the system. And that's why running as an incumbent proved so difficult for him, because he couldn't really readjust that way. But now you kind of have a counterpoint. And the thing is, like, not only was Walz not in politics, he was a public school teacher, right? Like, Trump wasn't in politics, but he was the son of a rich guy and doing various like rich guy extracurriculars, So it's a really good contrast. I think Shapiro would have been good. I think Kelly would have been good. I think she had kind of a lot of wealth to choose from, but I was rooting for Walz, and I'm glad that she went there in the end, and that she got to make a decision based on what she wanted to do. Because, like, I think we have this feeling that if you're in this position, if you're high up in politics and you want to be president, then getting the opportunity is like a huge, it's a great dream come true, right? But this is never going to be the conditions under which she would have wanted to make her bid for president. Like, she's got this crazy truncated time to make the case. Like, if she wins, it's going to be an incredible accomplishment that she got her campaign up and running and made an impression in this really short time, that she was able to shed the weight of the, fair or not, of the Biden candidacy and the doldrums that were surrounding that, and re-energize the party. And not only that, became the first woman, the first Black woman, the first South Asian woman to ever become president. To do all that, I mean, that's so difficult. It's so difficult. And the fact that she's doing well so far is it's astounding. But none of this was her choice, right? Like, she kind of had to wait for Biden to bow out and to give her this less than ideal condition to run in, knowing that if she loses, she is putting the next woman president farther down the line, because if Clinton loses and she loses, no matter the difficulties, that will be the conclusion, that it is just too risky to run a woman. So she's got all this going on, and I just think it's nice that she got the opportunity to kind of pick a running mate that not only has these advantages to her ticket, but also that she really likes, because this is an uphill battle for her. So it's good that her kind of number one teammate seems to be just someone that she genuinely gets along with well and thinks is a nice, fun guy to kind of wage war alongside.
There's been, we've talked a lot about the Blitz campaign and the dynamics of this 3-month campaign. And given how well it has gone for the last 2 weeks, you actually have a lot of people now saying, wow, how do we make the next campaign a 3-month blitz? This is so awesome. This is obviously the way you always want to do it, right? You sort of jam up the other side. And it does seem to be going that way. And whether or not she wins, I don't think there's any question. This has been a great way to do it. It is easy to lose sight of the fact that we all thought going in, for very good reasons, this is the worst possible way to run, to get thrown into a presidential campaign. We had a whole conversation of look, forget the Thunderdome theme. It has to be her, but kind of has to be her. That's not necessarily a good thing for her.
Right.
Because this is being saddled with a kind of seemingly an impossible situation, and you need to make the best of it. So it is, the dynamics of the race as they have developed, one can retrospectively say, well, this, that, and the other, and the Blitz, and all these kind of things. I think it remains inexplicable how it has developed in the way that it has, just in the sense that it is going to take a lot of unpacking to think through how exactly the dynamics have fallen into place in the way that they have. One point that I wanted to mention earlier in the thing, you talked about, how much is she saddled with Biden's baggage, all these kind of things. One thing that came out very early in the polls and is critical, and not clear to me why it's the case, that when they, one of the things that Biden was just an albatross for Biden is, even though he and the Federal Reserve got inflation down really fast over a period of about a year, that for most people, they're okay, yeah, inflation is down, but ground beef is still however many times higher than it was 4 years ago. So why I'm still upset. And when they polled this, is that Kamala's fault? And everybody's no, not really. That's not her problem. And okay, I'll take it. But why that would be the case is not clear. And I'm sure the Trump people are apoplectic about it, because she's the vice president. So why isn't it her fault too? But for whatever reason, it's not. And one of the, and maybe the Trump people will be able to change this, but one of the dynamics of, you hear that tagline, they said, not going back. We're not going back. And obviously that not going back means a lot of different things. We're not going back to the Trump years. We're not going back to the 1950s. We're not, all these different kind of things. But one dimension of it is they have been able to finesse this in a way that she's running as he's the incumbent. Trump is the incumbent president. We're not doing that again. We got to send him packing, right? And that's a feat when you're running as the incumbent vice president. One more thing we're a little over time here. One thing that came up as soon as the Walz announcement was made, or maybe it was the night before, where maybe the news sort of atmospherically was kind of bubbling out, that people were thinking it might be him. Republicans put out that a Republican operative from Minnesota put out this mugshot of Walz. In 1995, he was arrested for drunk driving. He was going something like 90 miles an hour on some rural road in Minnesota in a 55 mile an hour zone. And at least according to this Republican operative, and this part, I mean, the other stuff, that's true. That happened. Apparently, he tried to tell the cops that he was hard of hearing to get out of the arrest or something like this. But you look at the, and look, drunk driving is a serious thing. Innocent people are killed all the time by drunk drivers. It was perceived a little differently in 1995, but not totally. There was already MAD and all that kind of stuff. But you look at he was, I guess, 30 years old at the time. You look at the mugshot, and I saw some of the conversation about that. And, this is like up in like the north in Minnesota on some rural road. I don't think they got that. You look at it and you're like, all right, that's a good guy. Young kid. He's out being an idiot late at night. The mugshot, I don't know. They don't know how to handle him. Because, I saw people saying, like, if you haven't driven drunk 100 miles an hour on a rural road in Minnesota, like, you're not a real Minnesotan. I mean, look, I won't speak for Minnesotans, but they don't know how to handle him. And I think you're going to see more of that.
It's also just, I mean, we talked about this before, but he just has a suitcase of good anecdotes. Like, that DUI is why he doesn't drink anymore, right? Like, he used to have an A+ rating from the NRA until Parkland, where he was like, fuck this, and gave back their money, and, is a recreational hunter who passed universal background checks in Minnesota. Like, he's got a lot of good stuff about him, and a lot of stuff that is going to help, I think, balance out the ticket, blunt some of perhaps the most effective Trump camp attacks if they can ever kind of rally behind them. So Dems in array continues, Dems in delight. Yeah. Dems delirious.
We'll finish off on, I saw someone circulating that, what was it? Was it both AOC and Manchin put out press releases after he was picked, both of them saying, oh, he's the best ever. He was my first pick, blah, 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 blah. So that sort of, I mean, is Manchin even a Democrat anymore, right?
Right. But that is a thing, and I do want to let us wrap up, but it is I think Bakari Sellers has been saying this, who's like an advisor to the Harris campaign, but that a part of the VP pick is do no harm, right? Is like, you don't want to piss people off who weren't pissed off before. And in that way, Walz does seem to be just the universal likable guy. Like, everyone who knows him liked him. He has all these people from different stages in his life who like him. He is progressive, but he projects as a moderate. So, like bird-brained Manchin, who wouldn't really know anything about his record or think about that, is like, well, he's the get a beer with guy, so I like him. And then, AOC, who would pay attention to that stuff, also likes him. So, I mean, in that way, he's like this chameleon pick who kind of seems to satisfy every wing of the party.
And it also just it shows the centrality in our politics of cultural signifiers
that far beyond any policy planks or legislative agenda.
100% that you have these basic cultural signifiers that people place you in. And if you are a kind of a jovial weekend hunter who used to coach college, high school, you can pass a lot of progressive legislation and the stuff just bounces off you in a way that if you are, oh God, what is the guy? I'm spacing on his name, the former member of Congress who is now, I believe he's still the Attorney General of Minnesota.
Is it Keith Ellison still?
Yeah, Keith Ellison. Yeah. I don't know if he's still the AG, was the AG. You're Keith Ellison, man, you pass, a 5% cut on school lunch fees and you're a radical black nationalist, blah, blah, blah. Right. I mean, it's cultural signifiers are just huge. And, sometimes there are some very questionable things built into those signifiers, but sometimes you can use them to your advantage. And that's kind of where we are. And we've obviously gone a little long in this episode, but it's a lot of fun things to talk about.
Hey, so we had to catch up. We missed.
Yeah, we had to catch up. We had to catch up, and it was one of the most consequential weeks in like recent American political history.
Not that that's like saying a whole ton. Every week has been one of the most consequential.
Well, we're on 6 weeks now, where every week has been successively the most consequential in American history. Before we sign off, let me remind you, we are in the second half of our annual TPM Journalism Fund drive. We're doing well so far, but we really need to get to our goal, and we're in the hunt. But this is always the sort of the slog part of the drive. So if you haven't, if you've thought about contributing but haven't had a chance yet, please do. Now's a great time to do it. If you mainly listen to the podcast and don't often visit the site, just go to talkingpointsmemo.com and there'll be little signs up about contributing to the fund. So we make it really easy, and that is a big part of what makes it possible for us to do this pod. So don't forget, we're in as I said, the second half of our drive this year. It is really important, and absent, the bar is going up now for major news developments that would lead us to do an Instapod. But if there is big news, we will obviously join you on an emergency basis, and if not, we will talk to you again next Wednesday. See you then.
All right, see you then. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilcox. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.